Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy. This is episode number 86. Let's talk about sex.
Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Okay. I don't think it's going to be quite like that. But let's talk about sex.
Yes, not quite like that. But we had an awesome experience last night.
Yeah. Yes.
It was just fascinating. We're like, we have to talk about this.
It was with a group of people. It's family, but also friends.
Yes.
That are family, but they're our friends.
Yes.
And we usually have a really good time with this group of people, and we're very grateful for them. So if any of you are listening, thank you for a great time.
So I want to just set the scene for a minute. So we kind of do this thing now where we're trying to get together more frequently with other couples, other adults.
Adults. No kids.
Without the kids.
Can we bring our kids?
No.
Please don't.
And we're trying to do this to allow ourselves to really be able to foster our relationships and grow them and develop them, and also so that we can have adult conversations. I love conversations with parents and their children when we talk about Disney and movies and all the school projects.
I don't. I hate those conversations. I really do.
Those are great. But at the same time, if we don't create the time and put forth the effort to have adult conversations, it starts to become unbalanced and unhealthy. And I think sometimes, I think a lot of women, I know this was me, especially in the beginning of us having children. I craved adult conversations so much because I was just so used to being around kids, and just everything was like kid stuff all the time.
And I'm at work having adult conversations all day. And honestly, it's great to get away. I love having children. I love family. It's the most important thing is family. I think we believe that, and most of you, hopefully all of you, feel the same way. But children do not come between us.
Right.
They do not come between us.
Right.
And so I love being with our children and raising them and watching them grow and all that. But when they get in between us and our ability to be adults, that is unhealthy.
Yeah. And so as we've put forth the effort and, some of our family members and friends to say, hey, let's make sure we're putting forth the effort to get together, spend time together, talk about things, laugh together. It's so healthy. It does so much for our soul. And we're social people. We're meant to be social. We're not meant to live alone or in isolation. We're meant to have connections with one another. And so when we are able to put that on our calendar and say, hey, this is important, we need to say no to some things other times that may sound really fun. This always ends up being such a benefit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And last night was no different. So we got together, and I think there ended up being 5 or 6 couples, all married.
Yes.
And I think we all have kids.
Well, all married, and then we had 2 of my cousins that aren't married there, but it was great to having them there with us. And I think they actually ended up leaving before this conversation that you're going to talk about. But there may be people there that aren't married, and there may be people who have been married, and then so you gotta count them in too. So we want to spend time with those people as well.
Yes.
But what we're going to talk about is the married conversation that we had, like kind of at the end of the night.
Yes. Yeah.
The whole night was great.
Yes.
So anyway.
And it was interesting too, because as I was thinking about this conversation and reflecting on it, I was like, you know what? Everyone has a different number of kids. They're all different ages. We're all in different stages of life.
Yes.
And yet we were still very much talking about intimacy. We were still like, wait a minute, how do you think about this? It's different than what I thought. And it ended up just being awesome. So even if we're all at different ages and different stages of life with older kids, younger kids, whatever, being able to have these conversations in a mature way is amazing. It can do so much good.
And share stories about our experiences together, as married couples. And there are some funny stories that I might repeat a couple of them. I might,
or you might not,
without names. But it's great to listen to other people and their experiences.
Yes. So I just want to set the tone. So there was a bunch of us couples, maybe 6 of us, and we had dinner together. We had caught up on things probably for an hour or two, and then we kind of played with the idea like maybe we'll play a game, right? So we had a couple games available in case we wanted to. And one of the games was kind of like a charades game. And we never actually ended up playing the game because we ended up being so fascinated by just what was written on the cards.
Right.
And this is what just sparked us to all kind of gather around the table and just start talking about these sexy topics.
And there was a special box in the game. It was a not safe for work little box with like the naughty cards. And so we got those out and started reading them.
Yeah.
And I think that made it even more entertaining for sure.
Yes. So I just want to also bring up the point that having hard conversations doesn't mean we shouldn't have them, right? Talking about things that are uncomfortable or challenging, that's not the sign to not do it, right? Because if we think about things that were challenging for us growing up, reading was a challenge. Walking was a challenge.
Yeah.
Getting potty trained, those were challenging things. And they were very uncomfortable, I'm sure, for us growing up to do those things. And yet, look at the benefit.
I don't even remember those things, but I'm sure they were a challenge.
The benefit, though, of being able to have those things under our belt is so useful and awesome.
I think that's maybe why I was so hard on our kids. I'm like, come on, just walk. Like, I can walk. I don't ever remember learning. I could just always walk. Why can't you do it?
Right. So, yes, even though like a card would come up and maybe some of us knew what it meant, and we were like, oh no, like, are we going to talk about that? And other people were like, I don't know what that is. Just because something is challenging or uncomfortable, again, it's not the sign to not go ahead and work through uncomfortableness.
Right.
In fact, that's usually an indicator like, hey, there's something here. Let's take a closer look at it and see what we can learn and how we can grow from that experience.
And I don't think it's necessarily what was on the card that even mattered.
Right.
It wasn't what was on the card. And some of the cards were dirtier than others and nothing pornographic, really. I mean, there may be some things that some people might think are inappropriate. But what we were able to do is to interact with each other. And when someone says, I don't know what that is, and then we start talking about what it is, and someone might have a different definition than someone else, it's more about the interaction, the adult interaction, where you don't want your kids there because you're talking about things that would be inappropriate for children. But it gave us an opportunity to have social intimacy, right? We're not talking about a sexual experience here at all, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an adult experience where we're able to bounce thoughts off of each other, like us as a couple, able to share experiences with other couples and other couples sharing experiences that we all learned from. And it opened up our minds, I think, to being able to talk about things that we might have not talked about otherwise, one-on-one. And I think there's a lot of things that we can talk about with that. But that's the thing that I found I was grateful for, was that there was a conversation where we were able to take those, maybe even concerns from some of the couples, or maybe a little bit shocked by some of the things other people were saying. And there was a lot of laughter and a lot of shock. But the point is that we were able to interact with other couples and maybe even measure ourselves to some degree too, as to how we are as a couple compared to someone else. Not that we're trying to one up or compare, but I think it gives us a good kind of bird's eye perspective of where we are as a couple, and hopefully for the other couples as well. And maybe some of them said, you know what, I don't ever want to have that conversation again. And they may never come over to our house again. But
I think they're all going to come over.
But they can have that conversation and decide what's appropriate for them and what's not. At least they're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
So this is a communication skill that is so important for us to use. Is like, I love being with Shelly, and I'm actually a little bit antisocial sometimes. I don't like run out to be social, but when I am social, I see the benefit, and it really is beneficial to us as a couple, because then we have, we have more to talk about, and we have questions that we might ask each other based on a conversation that we had with other couples. Because when you bring in multiple minds, it's like that. It's that kind of hive mind, right? Like we're not all thinking the same, but you bring it in and we talk about the same things, and then we're able to fly away and kind of let it sink in our souls differently. And I think that's important.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really interesting too. And one thing I really appreciated about the whole conversation and experience was that no matter everyone's different ideas or opinions or understanding of any of the topics that we discussed, everyone definitely had a level of respect. And I think that's so important, because sometimes when you talk about sexual things, it can be difficult. And for people who didn't grow up in a family that talked about it a lot or openly, like for me, we hardly ever discussed it. It's important to be able to have that level of respect and say, like, wow, like I just didn't know that, or I had a completely different idea of what that was, And it was so fascinating to sit back and watch how many different opinions would come up, but everyone had respect for everyone's different understandings of it. And I think that is so valuable. And I love what you're saying about how, as we're listening and engaging in these conversations, it expands us as a human. Like our human experience is broadening, and we're learning more about other people, other couples, and that makes us self-reflect. And that's huge. And it really reminded me of a time when I was in like the thick of my classes for my degree in marriage and family and human development. And we would hear these case studies, and some of them were so horrible.
Right.
And hard to listen to. And it would make me very grateful for our relationship and where we were. And even though we had our own struggles and challenges, there's always someone that is going to have things worse than you are. And there's always going to be people that have things better. And so being able to broaden your own learning and being open to those stories and other people's experiences, it gives you so much more understanding of yourself and also so much more gratitude.
Oh, yeah.
And I know you brought that up too. And I think that is something that we sometimes underestimate, that in listening to other people's stories, other people's experiences, or how they think about things, we can feel grateful in those moments. Feeling grateful is an awesome feeling, and it leads us to do more beautiful things in life. And being able to like just sit in gratitude, like, okay, I'm glad where we're at right now.
It's one of the pillars of intimacy in a happy marriage. Almost every single study that you'll ever read about a happy marriage has gratitude in there.
Yeah.
You have to be grateful for your marriage and for your spouse. So find whatever you can about them that you're grateful for and focus on those things. We've talked about that a lot. When you focus on the negatives, when you focus on the things that you don't agree with or you don't like about your spouse, well, we've talked about how you can't really change them, right? You can't change them. They're not going to change unless you change yourself. But we're not talking about that right now. But when you focus on gratitude and when you show gratitude to your spouse, that's one of the sexiest things in the world.
Yeah.
And I know that because when I show you gratitude, I think you feel really good about that. And it definitely brings us closer together. When I feel gratitude from you, It definitely turns me on. I want to be closer to you. I don't want to be far from you when I know that you're grateful for me.
Yeah.
I want to be close to you. And I'm not talking about just sex, okay? This isn't just about sex. Intimacy is not just about sex, right? Emotionally, intellectually, physically, right? Those are like the three main kind of areas, right, of intimacy. There's a lot more than that.
Yeah.
But when you're grateful for me, when I know it, I want to do everything I can to make you happy too. Because I am grateful for you, and I feel more gratitude when I know you're grateful. And I think what you're saying is when you hear all these other things, other perspectives, when you see other couples interact, right? You don't do that because you want to feel better than them.
No.
But when you open yourself up to kind of the reality of marriage in the world, you realize that you have it very good in many areas. Maybe not every area,
Yeah.
but many areas you have it very good. And so it gives you an opportunity to remember that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the keys is also to gratitude is remembering, right? Remember why you fell in love with that person. And I think that social intimacy where you're talking about these things with other couples, I think that opens up that. It gives that spark so that you can, kind of take a step back and realize, hey, I've been bummed out all day because, I thought my wife was being kind of, mean to me. And then you see how many other people are dealing with that and worse.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, it's not as bad as I thought it was.
Yeah.
It just gives you perspective.
Yeah. It's so true. And I think one thing that came up while we were all gathered was our last podcast talking about sexy math. If you haven't watched that one, go back and watch Sexy Math.
It's 2 podcasts ago.
Okay. Yeah. 2 ago, where we just talked about the differences between the numbers of how often a man or a husband thinks about sex compared to his wife, and just looking at those differences. And so that was kind of one thing that contributed to this big conversation is how everyone was thinking about that, those who had listened to the podcast or watched it, and their own thoughts about it and how they were discussing it and talking to their spouse about it and their different ideas and what it meant or how they wanted to think about it differently. It was so fascinating.
And it was interesting because some of the couples were more open to that and to that conversation and okay with that reality of how much more men think about it than women in general. And then there were a couple of couples that, maybe, didn't feel as comfortable, admitting that, right? Or maybe it was a couple of the men, I should say, weren't quite as comfortable. And I can understand why, right? You don't want to necessarily admit that you're thinking about sex all the time. And we were talking about times when you think about sex when it's not necessarily about your wife either.
Right.
Not in a way where you're lusting after someone else, but where thoughts do cross your mind. And so I think understanding that reality and having a conversation about that one-on-one is super important, like we have. And we've been open with this. We've shared this on this podcast several times about that reality.
Yeah.
But when you are open in that conversation with other people, that might be the only time they've ever had that conversation. And now there may be some questions and it might, maybe it will lead to some struggle even, but at least they're having the conversation and then they're going to, I know that even if it's hard for a woman to hear, they will get closer if she approaches it in a way where she really wants to know and really wants to help. And if you don't have information, it's hard to get inspiration.
Yes.
Information brings inspiration. It does, because you have to have something to start with. And you're going to have pure intelligence come into your brain when it comes to, spiritual prompting. But inspiration really does come from a fundamental or foundational thought, and then you'll think about things around that thought. So I think it's important that we have conversations like that, and that might be the only time that you have a conversation that you need to have is with other people, and then you can have a private conversation later. So I think that's one of the main advantages as well.
Yeah. And it made me think too about a very important topic in life coaching, and that's the concept of being in a place of emotional childhood, which means you're approaching life from more of an immature way. You're not meaning to. It's just the skill level might not be where it needs to be.
Right.
And in life coaching, we say, okay, that's fine that you have been living life like this for now, but we need to make a conscious change to move over to living our life from emotional adulthood, which means that if you're married, it is now the appropriate time to have the harder conversations, to dive a little deeper into the sexual topics. It is the time assigned.
To ask your wife what she likes sexually, to explore your bodies together. That's adult.
That is adult.
And it's totally appropriate and it's necessary. And it makes me think about, when people first get married, a lot of people aren't prepared for that first night. And a lot of times, I think most of the time men have a different idea of what it's going to be like than the women do. And we want to do everything we can to help that, right? So we're going to have a future course that's about a pre-marriage course that prepares people for marriage. And I'm excited about that. But my point is, they don't know how to talk about it. And for those people who have tried to live lives of abstinence, when they're not abstinent anymore, it's a lot harder for many people. I won't say all or most, but many, to even talk about it even as a married couple.
Yeah, very true.
So finding opportunities to kind of break the ice even after you've been married for many years sometimes is enlightening, and it opens a door that is not dangerous at all. I mean, it's up to you if you want to make it dangerous or not, but just in and of itself, talking about the sexual side of us and the intimate side of us, and it doesn't all have to be about sex because everything connects. But if you're not talking about that and not exploring that with your spouse, then you're missing out.
Yeah.
And guys, you're missing out on what she really wants. And I'm pretty sure that if you're listening to this, you want to give your wife what she wants, and you're not that selfish. I'm just going to assume that you're not that selfish.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think that is so valuable from an activity like this, or an experience like this, is that we're able to educate ourselves from an adult perspective, right? We're at this level. We're giving ourselves that permission to say, hey, I don't know about this. Okay, we're bringing up vocabulary I've never heard before. And I think a lot of times we grow up with the fear of diving into these topics. And even as adults, we feel like if I want to learn about something I don't know and it's related to sex, it's all going to end up like pornographic, right? And so we have this fear. We assume that that's what's going to happen. And so what we do is we just say, I don't even want to go down that path, so I'm just not going to learn. But we're adults and we can navigate being able to educate ourselves responsibly. And I was so impressed last night that while there were some words that we were like, what is this? We were able to get our phones out and look up definitions. Now, we weren't looking at pictures.
Right.
We never headed down that path. But we looked up the definitions to say, okay, now I understand what this is. We're allowed to educate ourselves on these topics in a responsible and mature way.
Yeah, and you might be with somebody who would pull out the phone and look at pictures or videos or something. So you got to be careful. And look, this conversation isn't something that you're just like, hey, you want to go out on a double date and just start talking about this stuff, right? But if you're not opening yourself up to having adult conversations with yourself, within your couple, then maybe that's where you have to be open to that, so that you can maybe with other people, and maybe you needs to be a therapist. I don't know, but we're trying to encourage you to have adult conversations because they're healthy, and they give you as a couple perspective on other marriages as well. Because if you don't get that, then you're just going to hear things like the rumor mill, right? The rumor mill, you don't want to go there. The rumor mill is not the way to give yourself perspective, make yourself feel better, because that's usually why people gossip. Yeah. We're not talking about gossiping right now.
Well, and it's also, a lot of it's not true, right? It's like when throughout the conversation, we're like, I heard about this and I thought it was this, and we're like, wait a minute, let's clarify some of these things. And it's so enlightening when we do that, because then we're educated. We're educating ourselves. We don't have to be stuck in the rumor mill anymore.
Yeah.
We don't have to keep wondering, is that what that is? It's just like, no.
It actually helps with your desire to gossip in the rumor mill. Is that what you're saying? Like, it helps you to not need that as a human.
Yeah. And I think it's so easy for people to hear something, and let's say it's just not even true about something sexual, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe they'll never explore something that could be beautifully shared between husband and wife, because they have an idea that it's something that it's not.
Yeah.
And
Good
so
point.
that's why I think we're adults. When we're 18, you're considered a legal adult. And by definition, it means you are legally allowed to be involved in sexual content.
Well, I would say when you're 18, depending on what your beliefs are, maybe you're still trying to avoid that until you're married. I would say when you get married, then you take another step in adulthood.
Yes. I mean, I guess my point was just legally. Our brains when we're little, it's not meant for sexual content. I mean, this is just so well proven. And I think this is why mothers all over the world are fighting against what kids are being taught in the public school system.
Yeah.
The child's brain is not mature enough to be handling sexually explicit content. And that doesn't just mean visually. And so as an adult, our brains are mature enough. They've developed enough. They can handle adult content as it relates to sex. And so it becomes our responsibility to educate ourselves in a mature way, in a responsible way, on these harder topics that never crossed our minds, nor should they have when we were young. Now's the time to do it.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to point out as we get to the end of this podcast is that we didn't go into this activity planning on talking about this, right? We weren't like, hey, let's get everyone together and let's all talk about sex.
No.
It just happened naturally and organically, and we went with it, and it turned out fabulous.
We actually have a little bit of an open door into that because we talk about it a lot. But if you don't know anyone who talks about it and you want to talk about it, mention our podcast.
Yeah, that's true. Any final thoughts as we get to the end of this?
No, I just think it's good to get out of your little bubble. As much as I want to stay in my bubble, it's good to get out and interact and be social. I think it's good for the marriage for sure. And then it's not just what's said then; it's really what you do with that experience afterward.
Yeah.
And it might not be about sex; it might be about other things, right? It doesn't matter. But the important thing is to interact with other people. And then it gives you a good idea about where you're at too with your spouse.
Yes. Yes. So hopefully this next week you can kind of think about that and look for opportunities to be able to have mature, proper, appropriate, adult-like conversations about sex and be able to learn from the conversation in and of itself. This is the time when you're married to develop and grow in this area. And it is the time to move from immature views about it to mature adult-like views.
Yes.
And so I hope that we'll be able to give that some consideration this next week. So remember, the more you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you can restore it with your spouse. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you will join us again next week.